Hi there, everyone. Welcome to another episode of The John Allen Show. I am John Allen, the editor of Crux, an independent online Catholic news source. You can find us on the web at www.cruxnow.com. Again, that is cruxnow.com. I am also a proud fellow at the Word on Fire Institute of Bishop Robert Barron. You can find their resources online at wordonfire.institute. That is wordonfire.institute. As ever, during this coronavirus period, I am broadcasting from my home in the eternal city of Rome, Caput Mundi, the crossroads of the Catholic world, where things are continuing to gradually loosen up. As of this week, those of us who live in Italy can once again travel not only within the country, that is from one region to another. That was possible as of June 3rd, but as of the 15th, we can now also travel within the European Union, within Schengen countries. Still waiting to see when the day will be able to come when we can once again travel back and forth to the United States. But in the meantime, life has returned sort of to a new normal. We can go to Mass. The Pope is once again admitting limited numbers of the public to his audience, his Sunday Regina Caeli, now Angelus addresses, and his liturgies, and so on. And yet the coronavirus is still very much with us in its aftermath, and that's one of three stories we're going to be tracking for you this week. So let's quickly tick off the headlines, and then we'll dive into the context. The headlines are these. First, obviously, the big news story in the United States, and frankly now around the world, continues to be the killing of an unarmed African-American man by the name of George Floyd by a Minneapolis police officer, and the kind of surge of protest and anger related to racial prejudice and racial injustice that has triggered initially across the United States and really now around the world, including here in Rome, where there have been solidarity protests for George Floyd. The Vatican has been an unusually engaged player in the discussions that the George Floyd episode have generated. Pope Francis, in an audience on June 3rd, mentioned Floyd by name twice, which is uncharacteristic. Generally, the Vatican would think that a crisis in a particular country is a matter for that country's bishops to respond to with a level of concrete detail. It generally would restrict itself to sort of broad matters of principle in a situation like this, but instead, the Pope waded directly in, saying that we cannot turn a blind eye to any form of racism or exclusion while pretending to defend the sanctity of life. Some observers saw that, actually, as a rather pointed way for the Pope to call out what he and his allies have long seen as a certain kind of American Catholic who is overly focused on the so-called life issues, particularly abortion, to the exclusion of a kind of equal attention to other matters that are relevant to the protection of human life and human dignity. A couple of days later, the Pope made another unusual gesture. He picked up the phone and called an American bishop, in this case Bishop Mark Seitz of El Paso, to congratulate him, in effect, for having been photographed kneeling in prayer at a Black Lives Matter protest. Later, a senior American bishop here in Rome, who heads one of the Vatican's most important departments, led a prayer service for George Floyd and for the victims of racism organized by the community of Sant'Egidio, one of the new movements in the church and a particular favorite of Pope Francis. Now, however, the most important bit of Catholic subtext to the George Floyd situation, no doubt, is the crossfire that erupted between the White House and the Archdiocese of Washington after Archbishop Wilton Gregory of Washington objected in very strong terms to President Donald Trump visiting the National Shrine of St. John Paul II in Washington, among other things, claiming to have been, or at least people close to Gregory, claim that the Archbishop was blindsided by it. That has been contested by others. We will break all of that down for you. Second big headline continues to be the coronavirus, not so much the immediate public health threats posed by the contagion, which in many parts of the world have begun to recede, but rather the lessons that need to be learned from the coronavirus period, there are suggestions that both the broader international community in general and the Catholic Church specifically perhaps have not adequately mastered the lessons of the coronavirus in terms of being ready for the next big pandemic. We will try to break down what some of those lessons might be, and at least what some people are suggesting they ought to be in the course of this show. Finally, there is a new development on the on-again, off-again saga of Vatican financial reform. A week or so ago, lay Italian financier by the name of Gianluigi Torzi was arrested by Vatican police on suspicions of extortion in a controversial London land deal that has been sort of plaguing the Vatican for the last several months. This is a deal in which the Vatican Secretariat of State, its most important department, got involved in a $225 million purchase of a piece of land in the Chelsea neighborhood in London, a former Harrods warehouse, which originally was slated for conversion into luxury apartments, the idea being that the rents off those apartments would repay the investment and then some, that it would be a moneymaker for the Vatican. They then soured on the relationship with the original Italian sort of broker who got them into this deal, and they brought in this guy named Torzi to try to get them out of it. There are now suggestions that Torzi actually charged exorbitant fees to the Vatican for his services, knowing in effect he kind of had them over a barrel. Now, on the surface, this is being touted as a brave step forward for reform and accountability. The Vatican, in the meantime, after detaining Torzi for several days, has now released him on his own recognizance, but indications are they may be fast-tracking a trial in the Vatican Tribunal, which is now back in business after being locked down during the quarantine. However, the question that still has to be answered is this. This London deal, whatever the cast of characters may have been behind the scenes in orchestrating it, was approved at the most senior levels of the Secretariat of State. It was approved by, well, the first part of it was approved by one sostituto, now Cardinal Angelo Becciu, and then the second part of it involving Torzi was approved by Becciu's successor, Venezuelan Archbishop Edgar Peña Parra, and it was also, at least nominally, approved by Cardinal Pietro Parolin, the Secretary of State, in the number two official, in a sense, in the power structure after the Pope himself. Now, to date, not only have none of those senior figures in the Vatican been charged with any wrongdoing, they haven't even been called as witnesses, so far as we know. They haven't been questioned, haven't been interrogated. And the question that some people are raising is, can there be real accountability as long as the impression is that senior figures in the system are being insulated while lay Italian rogues, in effect, are being sort of presented as scapegoats? We will break that down as well. So those are the headlines. Stick around for the context.
Hey everybody, it's Jared Zimmer, the director of Bishop Robert Barron's Word on Fire Institute. I hope you're enjoying the John Allen Show, which is yet another production brought to you by the Word on Fire Institute. I wanted to take a few seconds just to invite you to become a member of the Institute, where we offer numerous different aspects that can help form you as an evangelist. Things like courses on theology and philosophy and psychology and sociology. You'll also receive a quarterly journal in the mail throughout the year. Another exclusive offer that we'll be having if you enjoy the John Allen Show is a live Q&A with John, where you can ask questions about the culture, the church, media, etc. So when you join, you also get free access to Word on Fire Digital, which houses all of Bishop Barron's feature films, topical studies, study materials, and the like. So visit wordonfire.institute and come help us proclaim Christ to the culture.
All right, let's begin with the George Floyd protests and the Vatican reaction thereto. So the killing of George Floyd, particularly that harrowing 8-minute and 46-second video showing George Floyd on his stomach on the street, sort of pleading with the Minneapolis police officer that he couldn't breathe, that ended, of course, in his death. And then quickly, eventually, was followed by the indictment of that officer for second-degree murder, the firing of the 4 officers involved, criminal investigations and indictments against the other officers. All that is still playing out, but was also followed immediately by a surge of protest, initially in Minneapolis and then radiating out across the country, all of which has been exacerbated by the fact that in the days since the Floyd killing, there have been 2 other episodes of African Americans being killed by police officers, which clearly has lent additional impetus to the protests and to the national conversation about race and racism that is unfolding. There's also been a surge of solidarity protests around the world, including, as I mentioned, here in Rome, in the city's fabled Piazza del Popolo, the People's Square, where these kinds of large-scale public demonstrations often take place. The Vatican has, beginning with Pope Francis himself and his Vatican team, have engaged this conversation on race in an unusually pointed way. As I mentioned, the Pope cited Floyd by name twice in his June 3rd general audience, very pointedly called on Catholics to resist racism and exclusion with the same commitment, the same emphasis with which they defend the so-called life issues, such as abortion and euthanasia and so on. The Vatican's diplomatic apparatus has been engaged. The Pope congratulated an American bishop who was seen kneeling at a Black Lives Matter protest. Cardinal Kevin Farrell, Irish-born American bishop, longtime Bishop of Dallas, who now heads the Vatican's dicastery for family, laity, and life, and is one of the Pope's closest allies and advisors, presided over a prayer service of solidarity for George Floyd here in Rome at the Chiesa della Santa Maria della Traspontina, which is the mother church, if you like, of the community of Sant'Egidio. That's a movement born in 1968 here in Rome in the immediate post-Vatican II years, very engaged in peace and justice work, in ecumenism, in interfaith dialogue, in conflict resolution, very near and dear to the heart of Pope Francis. And I think everyone believes that this event that Sant'Egidio organized and the presence of Cardinal Farrell as the main celebrant signified a kind of papal stamp of approval on the entire thing. Now, meantime, in the United States, the most noteworthy form of engagement we have seen from American bishops, doubtless, came from Archbishop Wilton Gregory, one of just 2 active African-American bishops in the United States. Archbishop Gregory of Washington, of the nation's capital, who issued a statement the evening before a visit by President Donald Trump to the National Shrine of St. John Paul II, objecting very strongly to that visit, saying he found it baffling and incomprehensible that a Catholic facility would allow itself to be used in that fashion. Bear in mind, the visit came just a day after police in the nation's capital had used tear gas to clear protesters in front of the White House so that President Trump could walk across the street to St. John's Episcopal Church and be photographed in front of the church holding a Bible as a way of saying that he was praying for healing and for calm in the wake of the George Floyd killing. Archbishop Gregory obviously objected to that disruption of peaceful protest, thought it was inappropriate for a Catholic facility to, in his eyes at least, be lending sort of credence and cover to such an act by allowing the president to appear on their grounds. A side note to this is that as this story was developing, some sources close to Archbishop Gregory and to the U.S. Bishops' Conference were saying that neither the Archbishop nor the Bishops' Conference had been given any advance notice of this visit by the president to the shrine. Now, subsequently, there has been a reporting that suggests that, in fact, this visit was planned at least a week in advance. In fairness, at that stage, it was intended as an opportunity, because that was before the George Floyd situation, it was intended as an opportunity for President Trump to sign another executive order on religious freedom. Obviously, the character of the visit evolved significantly in the wake of the Floyd killing and protests. In any event, there is now a sort of tit for tat going on about what exactly Archbishop Gregory knew and when he knew it. But the substance of the story remains intact, which is a strong objection from the Archbishop of the nation's capital to a visit by the President of the United States to a premier Catholic shrine, a shrine, by the way, that is owned by the Knights of Columbus. And so that situation is unfolding, and it probably speaks to deeper tensions in the American church about what the right response to the Floyd situation is, and also tensions over the assessment of the president's handling of the situation, all of which may have a bearing later this year, because, of course, in November, despite it all, Americans are still scheduled to go to the polls and choose between the incumbent President Trump and his Democratic challenger, former Vice President Joe Biden, himself, of course, a Roman Catholic. One other side note to all of this is that if you're wondering what the Vatican made of this crossfire between the White House and Archbishop Gregory, it might be worth noting that just a couple of days later, Archbishop Gregory took part in a video conference sponsored by Georgetown University's Institute for Catholic Public Life, talking about race and racism in America. Archbishop Gregory gave a 20-minute or so presentation in which, among other things, he defended his reaction to the president's visit to the shrine. Surprise guest at the end of that call was Cardinal Peter Turkson of Ghana, who heads the Vatican's Dicastery for Promoting Integral Human Development, another close friend and ally of Pope Francis, who made a point of joining Archbishop Gregory and echoing. He didn't address directly, Turkson did not directly address the controversy with Trump, but he certainly projected a tone of great support and appreciation for Archbishop Gregory, and that was taken, I think, in many quarters as a kind of indirect way of the Vatican saying, we've got your back. So we will see how this story plays out. I think it is fair to say that the conversation that the Floyd situation and subsequent events has opened in America is far from being closed. It will continue to have repercussions in the society and in the church. We will continue to track all of that. All right, secondly, the coronavirus and its aftermath. As I mentioned at the top of the show, Italy, where, of course, the Vatican is located, is in the midst of a gradual, what the Italians call ripresa, or sort of reopening, restarting. That's true of much of Europe and much of the world. However, even though trend lines in many places do seem to be moving in the right direction, many experts are warning not only are we not yet out of the woods for the coronavirus, but in some ways, we may not have seen anything yet with the coronavirus, and then the next pandemic, whatever form it takes, may actually be substantially worse by some order of magnitude. This month's issue of Foreign Affairs magazine is actually devoted to precisely that question. The opening essay is written by a director of pandemic research at the University of Minnesota and his colleague. In it, Michael Osterholm makes the argument that the American response to the coronavirus revealed serious failures, both in long-term readiness and in short-term response. He is suggesting that we need to be planning now for the next pandemic because researchers, clinicians, epidemiologists all know that it is entirely possible that we could see another major global pandemic in the not too distant future. The nightmare scenario is that pandemic will not be akin to the coronavirus, but it will be a novel version of the 1918 Spanish flu influenza, which is believed to have killed around 100 million people around the world. If you adjust for population size, that would be the equivalent of 400 million fatalities today. And according to Osterholm and his colleagues, it's really not a question of if that's going to happen, it's a question of when. He is suggesting a military-style response. That is, just as the Army doesn't wait for a war to break out to buy battleships and missiles and tanks and so on, governments should not be waiting for the next pandemic to be making investments in personal protective equipment, in masks and gloves, in emergency supplies, in ventilators, the kinds of medical equipment that we know are going to be essential, that will make the difference between life and death. He's suggesting that disaster preparedness plans now be in place. He cites a common saying among emergency planners that you don't want to be exchanging business cards at a disaster site, that these relationships have to be established in advance, lines of authority have to be clear, responsibilities have to be clear. He is suggesting that now is the time to be doing all of that. Now, in a sense, Pope Francis is echoing that in another of his recent general audiences in which the pontiff spoke about the coronavirus. He said explicitly that this may not be the last such threat that the world sees, and we have to be ready now. So the question is, what would readiness now in Catholic terms look like? I recently penned a column in which I suggested, only half jokingly, that perhaps what the Vatican needs is a dicastery for disasters. That is, a department in the Vatican whose specific mission is preparing the global church for global public health emergencies. Because that is the definition of a pandemic, after all. It is not localized to one place. It does not respect borders. It is, by definition, a global threat. And therefore, if the global church is going to respond effectively, that response, to some extent at least, has to be coordinated in its global headquarters in Rome. I suggest that the responsibilities of this dicastery, first of all, they could be helping dioceses around the world develop their own emergency preparedness plans, in the same way that the Vatican is committed to helping dioceses around the world develop their own policies on combating clerical sexual abuse. So much so, the Vatican has actually mandated those policies and then created a commission, part of the responsibility of which is precisely to provide dioceses and religious orders and so on with the resources and expertise they need to get that job done. So there is a blueprint in place. The same thing could be done with pandemic planning, with public health emergency planning. Secondly, I suggest this dicastery or department, or whatever word the Vatican would end up using, could be responsible for working with Catholic charitable organizations around the world, beginning with the Rome-based global federation Caritas Internationalis, to develop emergency relief plans, and also long-term support plans for communities that are especially economically impacted by pandemic shutdowns and public health crises. The Pope actually recently gave an example of what that could look like, acting as the Bishop of Rome. He, in concert with the city of Rome and the region of Lazio that surrounds Rome, created a special solidarity fund to assist people who've been unemployed or who have seen significant losses in income and are struggling to support families as a result of the coronavirus lockdowns and resulting economic contractions. Third, I suggest that this Vatican department could do a kind of look back at best practices during the coronavirus, particularly in terms of online liturgies, online spiritual care, and sort of present blueprints, resources, models to dioceses and parishes around the world for how to do this sort of thing effectively the next time we find ourselves in lockdown. They could also, this department, be looking at the most prominent spiritual needs that presented themselves both during the quarantine and also in its aftermath. Try to put together the best spiritual writing, the best liturgical practice, and so on, that in various parts of the world that were developed in response to those unique needs. And again, try to put together some kind of vade mecum that would put those resources at the disposal of the people who need them. Then finally, this dicastery could also examine the church-state issues that arose during the coronavirus, that is, the church's response to government-imposed restrictions on practice, and again, try to identify the places that seem to negotiate those issues the best. Provide some basic principles to bishops and religious orders and other decision makers around the world, so that the church's response isn't just ad hoc. You don't have a sense that the church is making it up as it goes along, but rather there's some kind of reasonably coordinated and uniform approach. We will see if such a dicastery is created, but whether such a department is launched in the Vatican or not in a formal sense. The point is, those are four challenges the church is going to have to face. Somebody's going to need to take lead on helping the global church do that, because, to repeat, according to the people who know best, it's not a question of if we will be in some kind of lockdown or quarantine related to a public health emergency again. It's a question of when. And the right time to be ready isn't in the when, it's in the right now. Okay, finally, Vatican finances in the promise and the peril of Vatican financial reform. So, the most recent scandal that has been playing out really since before the coronavirus, it broke open really in February, pivots on this $225 million land deal in London that was orchestrated by the Vatican's Secretariat of State. That's the kind of 800-pound gorilla of the Vatican scene, the department that coordinates all the other departments, and everything has to run through it. So it is kind of the ultimate power broker in the Vatican. It drew on funds from the Peter's Pence annual collection, which is sort of presented around the world as a chance for ordinary Catholics to support papal charities, although if you read the statutes for Peter Pence, it actually says to support the activities of the Pope, meaning he has very broad discretion as to how that money can be used. So money from Peter's Pence was used to buy this piece of property in London, originally to buy a 50% share in the property. Then the Vatican soured on its relationship with an Italian financier by the name of Roberto Mincione, who had helped them make that deal. They wanted to get out of it, so they brought in another financier by the name of Gianluigi Torzi, whose job was to try to buy them out of this deal, to try to buy the remaining shares so they would be the 100% owners. A loan from the Vatican Bank was created to finance that deal, or was requested, rather, to finance that deal. That's the stage at which the transaction was reported, signaled to Vatican investigators, who launched an internal probe. It was judged to be sort of dubious. So far, 7 Vatican employees have either resigned or been fired as a result of these investigations, including the Vatican's former top anti-money laundering expert and its former top cop, the head of the Vatican gendarmes. Most recently, this second financier, Torzi, was indicted under Vatican criminal statutes for alleged extortion on the basis of allegations that the fees he requested, reportedly in the neighborhood of 20 million euro, about 25 million US, were significantly disproportionate related to the value of the transaction, and that he was essentially hijacking the Vatican because he knew that it desperately wanted out of this deal and would pay essentially whatever he asked. Torzi was brought in for an interrogation. He was then charged. He was detained for a few days in the Vatican jail cell, the same cell in the headquarters of the gendarmes, by the way, where Paolo Gabrielli, the former papal butler, who was at the heart of the first Fatty Leaks scandal under Pope Emeritus Benedict XVI, once cooled his heels for a while. Then early this week, Torzi was released on his own recognizance. Word is that the Vatican wants to fast-track the criminal trial against Torzi and others involved in the London deal. All of this, of course, is being presented as an illustration of the Vatican's commitment to integrity, to accountability, to transparency in its financial dealings. Now, the hard question, however, that's being asked is this. In the case of the London deal, we know that it was initiated and put into action by the Secretariat of State. We know that the first phase of the London deal was approved explicitly by then Archbishop Angelo Becciu, who later was named the head of the Vatican's Congregation for Saints and made a cardinal. So he is now Cardinal Becciu. We know the second phase of the London deal, the one that involved Torzi, was approved by Becciu's replacement, Venezuelan Archbishop Edgar Peña Parra. And both transactions, of course, had to be signed off on by the Cardinal Secretary of State, Italian Cardinal Pietro Parolin. Now, all three of those figures, Parolin, Becciu, Peña Parra, on any list, short list, of the most powerful figures in the Francis papacy, they would be top five. Easy. There's a perception that Becciu has sort of lost favor, but certainly for a long time, Becciu would have been top five, if not top three. So the question that is being asked is, if there was criminal wrongdoing in this case, why haven't these guys been given a look, either as suspects or at least as witnesses? Now, there is a theory going around that actually these three guys, that is Parolin, Becciu, and Peña Parra, may be the victims in this case. They may have been duped by these unscrupulous Italian operators. And for all we know at this stage, that may very well be the case. In fact, it may well be the most likely explanation of events. Still raises the question, though, on the subject of accountability, whether there might have been a failure of due diligence here to vet these figures adequately before entrusting so much Vatican money to them. In other words, maybe there wasn't a first-degree offense here, but perhaps there is a case for a second-degree offense or at least a misdemeanor. In any event, the question as this process unfolds is whether this perceived, at least, sort of iron curtain of impunity around the most senior figures in the system will be breached, whether they will at least at trial be called as witnesses, and if there is evidence of either knowing wrongdoing or of someone at least should have known, had a duty to know, will there be some kind of attempt to impose consequences? I think many observers will find the claims of a kind of significant turning point in accountability difficult to accept until that's the case, especially because there does seem to be a pattern here that whenever there is a messy financial scandal in the Vatican, there is always some lay Italian figure who was involved, who is sort of trotted out through a series of public statements and then a trial, and presented, at least, as the heart of the problem. Some would argue as a kind of scapegoat. And meanwhile, the clerics, senior clerics in the system, never seem to find themselves in the dock. And so it will be interesting to see whether that pattern holds this time, or whether we are in for a real, if you'll pardon the pun, because we're talking about the Holy See, whether we're in for a real sea change. All right, that's the John Allen Show for this week. Thanks for being with us. Please keep checking out the Crux site for the best in smart, wired, and independent Catholic journalism. That is cruxnow.com, cruxnow.com. Also, keep checking out the Word on Fire Institute page for the very best in spiritual resources and thoughtful Catholicism in this era. That's wordonfire.institute. Again, wordonfire.institute. If you like this podcast, please tell your friends and neighbors. Spread the word. We will talk to you again in a couple of weeks here. In the meantime, stay safe, stay healthy, and have a blessed fortnight.